Good morning. Hi, this is Wendy Smith, and I am one of the academic directors of the Women's Leadership Center and a professor of leadership at UD. And I am thrilled and honored to welcome you to the third webinar in our Leadership in Times of Crisis series. Welcome back to those of you who have been with us, and welcome to those of you that are just tuning in for the first time. This series has grown tremendously over the past couple of weeks, and we are thrilled to have over 800 people registered with us. So welcome and thank you for being part of this community. We also want to say thank you to those that have stepped up to sponsor this webinar so that we can continue to provide this content. So thank you to Wawa and to Delaware Prosperity Partnership. If you or your organization want to sponsor us going forward, please do reach out to us. We'd be happy to have that conversation. For those of you that are joining us, thank you again. This is, as I said, our third session. We have 3 more scheduled coming up, so please do feel free to register online with us. And if you've missed the previous sessions or want to go back and see them or want to share them with your boss, those recordings are also online. So please feel free to go and take a look at those. As you might have seen, we in this session and in our last session moved into Zoom webinar format, both to allow us to expand our audience and community and to have a bit more control over the video and audio. So I just wanted to say 2 things. I know many of us are quite experienced at this moment with Zoom, maybe overwhelmed with Zoom. Just as a quick comment, Zoom webinar is a bit different in that it doesn't allow you to put on your audio or video settings. So we can't see or hear you, although you could see and hear us. But the way to interact with us is here in the chat feature. And we hope that you'll use that liberally to connect with one another, to offer us your thoughts or your insights, to provide any resources that you think will extend the conversation, and certainly to put questions for our panelists in there. We'll be monitoring the chat for those questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but hopefully we'll get to as many as we can. And we will, after this session later on, send out some of the highlights from the chat of resources and ideas. So we will provide those going forward. In addition, those of you that signed on with us before 9 a.m., heard some music, our team has created a Spotify playlist. So here I want to say thank you to our DJ, if you will, Aaron Schizarenza, who started us off with a Spotify Women Power playlist. And we welcome you to join us in the music and in the inspiration. I know that I have been working out to this playlist. So if you're interested, feel free to email us. We'd love to have you part of that community of inspiration as well. I am thrilled to turn to today's session. One thing that we know, or let me say it this way, there is a lot that we do not know in the world right now. One thing we do know is that conflict exists and it is inevitable in the world in general, and particularly in this world that we're experiencing at the moment with the tremendous amount of uncertainty that we feel. Conflict is exacerbated. And so one question is, if conflict exists, how do we take those tensions and allow them, how do we understand them, how do we unpack them, and how do we allow them to help us to provide some generative opportunity rather than draw us down? And that conflict exists all over the place, and I am thrilled that we have 2 experts on leadership and on conflict to help us unpack those questions and really to rise up to meet this occasion, to navigate those conflicts in ways that we can rise up and meet this occasion where it is. I am thrilled to have Dr. Jennifer Goldman-Wetzler with us, who's the founder and CEO of Alignment Strategies Group, a New York-based consulting group that advises CEOs and their teams on how they can be at their best She is the author of the book Optimal Outcomes: Free Yourself from Conflict at Work, at Home, and in Life. I just had the chance to reread the book, and I'm so thrilled, Jen, to have you here with us. Jen is a former counterterrorism research fellow with the Department of Homeland Security in the United States. She's coached and consulted with CEOs, senior teams, and brings that to our conversation today. We also have Dr. Wanda Wallace with us. Wanda is a managing partner of Leadership Forum, where she coaches and facilitates conversations with leaders to improve their conversations and their effectiveness. She specializes in helping women and men get to the top and to thrive there. And her emphasis on helping managers is to break out of their idea of expertise to really be the most effective that they can be and to create really inclusive cultures. Wanda is the host of the radio show Out of the Comfort Zone, and her latest book is You Can't Know It All: Leading in the Age of Deep Expertise. Wanda, it's great to have you here as well. Jen, it's great to have you here. Welcome to both of you. I look forward to having this conversation. I'm going to just jump in. So some of you will know that we're just going to jump right into conversation based on feedback we've had on this webinar, because both of you have so much to offer us. And I'm just going to jump right in, Jen, with you and some of the ideas in your book. Your book, Optimal Outcomes, which I have right here, sort of is really critical in this crisis. You draw on work on conflict, both at the macro level, you draw on work on conflict at the micro level in our individual lives. And the central thesis of this book is that conflicts exist and some of them just can't be resolved. And so maybe we should stop trying to resolve ourselves from conflict or resolve the conflict and instead free ourselves from it. So, Jen, what does that mean? Maybe you can just start off by unpacking this shift from resolve to free ourselves.
Sure. Well, first of all, Wendy, thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be with you all. The reason I wrote this book is because I've spent the last 20 years teaching principled win-win negotiation and conflict resolution methodologies coming out of the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School, the book Getting to Yes, if people are familiar with it, Difficult Conversations. And all of this work over those 20 years I've found has been incredibly helpful to so many people around the world, in business settings, in government settings, in academic settings, nonprofits. And yet, what I found over and over again is that sometimes win-win collaborative methodologies just don't work. And so all of the work that I've done over the last 13 years has been dedicated to figuring out not only why does it not work, because I could have stayed stuck in answering the question of why does it not work for the rest of my life and still not had something to say about how do we get out of it, but also that question of, well, what do we do when we're stuck? So I think about conflict as we have a conflict habit that we use, other people have their own conflict habits, and we get stuck, locked in a pattern of interaction that becomes very difficult to break free from. And I call that being stuck on the conflict loop. So rather than trying to resolve something that is not resolvable, it's a loop, it's just going to go around and around. Our job is to free ourselves from that loop in a very simple way by doing something different from what we've done before. So we can talk more about how to do that, but that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, Jen, in your book, you have so many examples of what that might mean. Can you just give us a brief example of like what it looks like to move from resolve to free? So we sort of get what that looks like.
Yeah. So there are 4 conflict habits that I name in the book. We either tend to blame other people when we're stuck in conflict. We avoid other people to the point where we might shut down completely. Some of us blame ourselves, and others of us relentlessly seek to collaborate even when other people are not interested in collaborating with us. And so as an example, I mean, there's so many different examples I could give, but I'll give an example that I use in the book. It's throughout the entire book, and it's about me and my mom. And, you know, my mom and I had felt blamed by her for not calling her often enough. She had felt upset and angry at me that I wasn't calling her often enough, and I felt like I was a bad daughter, and she's so frustrated. And this would just happen, you know, every few weeks or months. This would come up again and again in our relationship. And after, you know, throwing down the phone and bursting into tears, one day I just stopped and I asked myself, what is going on here? And I was able to notice that my mom and I are stuck in a blame pattern. We're just stuck on this loop, and it's just going around and around. So I had to ask myself, what else could I do? And there are 8 practices in the Optimal Outcomes method that help us get there. It's not just typically, you know, one day I just see the light and decide what else I could do. But I needed to raise my empathy for myself and for my mom. But you can ask yourself a very simple question. And in fact, there's a quiz that people can take online at optimaloutcomesbook.com/assessment. And you can find out which one of these 4 is your primary conflict habit, so that you can then ask yourself that question, what could I do that would be different? So for me, rather than picking up the phone and saying, sorry, Mom, I can't talk, boom, or not picking up the phone at all, I had to ask myself, what else could I do? Yeah. What else could I do? And it turned out that I needed to remind myself, what I discovered through the 8 practices was that I needed to remind myself that the only reason my mom was ever calling me was because she loved me. And through that, I was able to have a sense of freedom in this situation where she wasn't calling to attack me. She was calling because she wanted to connect with me, because she loved me. And that really shifted the entire dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah. Wanda, I want to Jen, we'll go back to these conflict habits and unpack this a little bit more. But before we do, Wanda, I want to turn to you. One of the things that you say in your book is that effective leaders really know how to navigate conflict. This is like a critical skill of leadership. So before we get to like how we do it, I want to just unpack this question, like, what do we mean by conflict? So, you know, Jen's worked on Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. Like, these are like big, intractable issues. I don't think we're solving the Middle East, you know, peace challenges right now. So, like, when you think of conflict, what are we talking about? What do we mean?
It's a pleasure to be here, and what a great group to talk with as well. When I work around the world, I find people have very different interpretations of this word conflict. So I often, especially in Europe and definitely in Asia, if I say conflict, everybody is freezing, pushing away from the table, going, oh, no, I don't have conflict. Because to them, conflict means to the point where we have gotten to literally ready to kill each other. Like, there's just so much animosity, there's no hope left in this. And I think in the, you know, like in the US in particular, I don't think that's what we mean by the word conflict. So I think it's important to say, in conflict, we're talking about where we both care about something, we've got a stake in the game, and we can't agree on a way forward, and it matters. And we feel the tension, the disgruntlement, the disparagement at times, a range of emotions around this. But conflict then refers to, we just disagree and it matters. At least that's the definition I use to talk to people. Then everybody kind of calms down and say, oh, okay, we can talk about that. The second thing I say is, if you don't have any conflict in your work life, then you're not doing anything important. Because our organizations are set up to have competing views. One product line versus another product line, one budget versus another budget, global versus regional, manager versus subordinate, and it's just everywhere. And if you're not talking about it, you're not talking about the stuff that's going to make a difference for your success.
Yeah, and disagreeing just means that we have different points of view, that if we can bring them together, you know, in my work around both and, how do we sort of think about them as valuable? So, you know, so what you're saying is we've got to go from thinking about conflict as a bad thing to thinking about conflict as the thing, and how we negotiate it is sort of leads to good or bad.
I've been saying for the last several years that the companies that win over the long run are the ones that get good at managing conflict.
Yeah.
But now, I'm with Jen on this one. I don't think we need to always think about conflict as win-win, because it is not always possible that everybody wins in the equation, and that's a mistake to even try. Because either I'm going to get the job or you're going to get the job, or I get the budget or you get the budget. Half of a budget doesn't do anybody any good. So we're going to win and lose. Now the question is, how do we draw that balance? And how do we have that conversation so people walk out of it not feeling stuck, angry, destructive in ways? And I think that's what's so powerful about the habits.
Yeah, and as Jen was saying, we can have conflict all over the place with our moms, especially for women with their moms, not to get stereotypical, with our partners, with our kids, with our bosses, and indeed these conflicts reinforce each other. We've got hundreds of people online. So for those of you in this community, before we go forward, one question that we have is who you're having conflict with. So who are the people that are really sort of the most pressing conflicts right now? So I'm going to put up a poll to invite you to respond to. This poll asks you who you're experiencing conflict with at the moment, and you can write as many people as you experience. What do you guys think? So, Jen or Wanda, if you can see the results, what's your reaction? It looks like spouse and partner is rivaling with peers and really at the top of the list over our managers or our kids who we're fighting with to stay off of screens. So What do you guys think? What's your reaction?
Well, Wendy, if it's any, to me, it's actually pretty interesting that I've done this poll now a few times on various webinars over the last few weeks, and spouse partner has taken the cake on all of them. So interesting that that's more or less true here as well. And it's not hard to imagine why we're stuck at home and needing to negotiate with spouse partner about not only housework and children and how we're going to allow ourselves to go out or not go out and how we're going to touch groceries or not touch groceries, but also negotiating about work time and things that we haven't had to negotiate about in a long time, if ever.
Yeah, Wanda, what's your reaction?
Well, I'm not surprised because I think front and center at the moment is what's happening at home. When you spend so much time away from the house, you can kind of ignore some of the tensions at home. And now that we're not spending any time away, it doesn't surprise me. Yeah. But I will tell you in my coaching sessions and in all the work that I do that the number one I hear is a peer that I feel it isn't working well with. And we had all sorts of attributions about why, back to Jen's 4 approaches to conflict. And we've known for ages that the reason you leave a company is because of the manager. So no surprises to me on that one.
Yeah, so one of the things that's striking to me is that when conflict happens with somebody, it certainly spills over. It's not easy to contain it in just one domain. And so that's one thought. And, I just want to kind of go back to acknowledge this question about spouse and partner. One of the things that I experience in our Women's Leadership Forum when we bring women together is that there's tons of tension that happens with women, particularly who are working and out in the work world with their partners and spouses. My experience, and I'm curious what you guys think, is that somehow that topic feels somewhat taboo. So in our Women's Leadership Forum, we talk about all kinds of things. We talk about navigating challenges with kids and home, and we talk about tasks at home. And we've even gotten into the conversation about salary and how to navigate that. But somehow the conversation about there's tension with my spouse or my partner feels hard to talk about for women. I'm curious what you guys think.
Yeah, I don't know how much, I don't know exactly what there is to say other than yes. I think there are certain things, in my work I talk about ideal values and shadow values. Ideal values being things that we're proud, that we care about in the world and that we're proud to say we care about. And shadow values being things that we really care about in life and that we are not proud to say we care about. And we won't even admit these things to our own selves, things like status or recognition, power, control, financial security. So yesterday I was doing a podcast interview and we were talking about conflict coming up with spouses today stuck at home. And the person who was interviewing me said, yeah, like the idea that, and we were talking about it in context of shadow values. And he said, yeah, like the idea that, men don't do laundry. And then he kind of had this shocked look on his face, and he said, I didn't mean that, that's not me. And so I said, yeah, that's the point, that there are certain things that we keep down, we push down out of our conscious awareness. And I think the notion that we might have conflict with our partners is something that is taboo in many places around the world. Not easy to talk about. So the question in my mind is, what can we do that might make it easier to talk about these things so that we can get the help that we need? Sometimes the best help might come from a therapist, but other times great help can come from friends and family if we would only let them in to what's going on for us.
Yeah. Yeah, Wanda, any thoughts from you when you have talked to people around the world? Spouse and partner tensions eke into everything we do.
Yeah. I'm going to give a quote from Esther Perel, which she says, you bring your relationship and emotional diary with you to work.
Yeah.
And I promise you, in my daily work, teaching people and coaching, whatever is going on at home, whatever conflicts are unresolved there are showing up in some form in the way you walk in the workplace. And I think the reverse is true. I think when you've got a tension going on in the work environment that we can't figure out how to resolve, it walks its way home to the family. So it'll come down to, we have to get better at having these kind of conversations in a constructive way, in an honorable way, because they're affecting all of our lives and our health, by the way.
Yeah. So we've sort of unpacked what we mean by conflict and suggested that it's all over the place and that they're intertwined. And I know I'm itching. I imagine that people on the call are like, okay, so what do I do with this? How do I deal with this? And so, Jen, I want to just start with you. You started us off by unpacking this notion of conflict habits as a first way to think about or unpack our understanding of ourselves as we go into navigating conflict and freeing ourselves from it. So I want to go back to that and see if we can unpack that a bit more. What are these conflict habits and why is it important as a starting point to think about conflict?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to take your question in reverse. So the second part first. The reason it's important to notice what your conflict habits and patterns are is because typically when we're stuck on that conflict loop, it's going around and around and we can't figure out how to get off. We're doing, trying to fix, trying to resolve that situation. And something that can be pattern breaking to help free us from that loop is simply stopping, taking a pause and noticing what is going on. And a great way to do that is to simply stop and ask yourself, what might my primary conflict habit be? And then take your best guess at what the other person or people involved in your situation, what their conflict habit might be. So just taking a pause is pattern breaking for most of us in and of itself. And now the first part of your question, what are these conflict habits and can I talk about them in a little more detail? Yes. So we use these conflict habits with the best of intentions. So for those of us who might know that we have a competitive side to us, we want to win an argument, right? And sometimes we do, and that can be helpful. We show other people why our point of view makes sense, and that can be a wonderful thing. The problem is when we use this competitive side of ourselves, regardless of the situation that we're in, it can warp into ending up blaming and attacking other people, that their point of view is not correct, they're wrong, we always need to be right. And when that's the case, we're not winning anything at all. We are just blaming and attacking, or that's how people feel, that we have blamed and attacked them. And what does that lead them to do? One of two things, either blame us back or shut down. It doesn't typically get us very far. So we stay stuck on that conflict loop. When we avoid conflict, could be a great thing. If the situation's not that important to us, the issue's not that important to us, the person or people involved are not that important to us, great idea to avoid a conflict situation. But when we do this in a habitual way, what happens is the conflict is kind of brewing, and boom, boils over typically, and then we really have something that we need to deal with and we can't avoid it any longer.
Yeah.
And now it's blown up. With blaming ourselves, the positive here is that we're often trying to learn. What would we do differently next time? How could we make this better? How can we make sure this never happens again? That's great, taking responsibility on ourselves to do something differently. But when we do this in any situation, regardless of the extent to which we actually have responsibility for making the situation what it is, we end up stewing in negative self-talk, and that's not helping anyone. The conflict loop is going around and around while we stew in our self-pity. And then finally, relentlessly seeking to collaborate. So many of it, this is a very common conflict habit, particularly for women, I think. So many of us have been taught now from a very young age that collaboration is how we're going to get things done. And in many organizations, it's true. Collaboration is how you're going to get things done when you're in a matrixed organization, for sure. The problem is when that's the main way, or the only way we know how to negotiate or know how to collaborate or be in conversation with other people, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes other people are not willing or able to agree back with us. And so what happens is they either shut down or they blame us, and we don't get anywhere. We're still stuck in that conflict loop. So we want to ask ourselves, what else could we do? What else could we do instead? But the first part is just noticing.
Yeah. Well, I love your pause and notice. In some ways, it really resonates with the conversation we had 2 weeks ago, where we were talking about staying grounded, and Golby suggested to us the importance of just breathing and pausing amidst all the chaos that we have. So there's some bit of interwovenness of these conversations. And you're suggesting pause and then diagnose your own habits. So we have a second poll here for everybody to weigh in on, which is the nature of the conflict habits. And so those of you who are online, here are the 4 conflict habits that Jen just described. And Jen, the poll's open while people are taking the poll. The question is, which is your primary habit? Jen, maybe you can give us just a succinct what the 4 are as people are responding.
Blame others.
Yeah.
We tend to blame and attack other people
Yeah.
when something has gone wrong or we're stuck in that conflict loop. Some of us shut down, so we avoid to the point where we are not even talking to other people involved in our situation. Others of us will blame ourselves and even shame ourselves. Leaving us feeling like we're the one who did something wrong, regardless of the situation itself, and whether that's objectively true or not. And then finally, relentlessly seek to collaborate with other people.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a couple of votes still coming in. I'm just going to leave it up for another couple of seconds for any last votes. I mean, I think your point here, which is what people are doing now, is to just start by knowing yourself. Right, Warren Bennis, who wrote great books on leadership, says the number one point of leadership is know yourself before you can actually engage. And so I'm going to stop the polls. Again, if you have more comments to add, you can add it to the chat. Here's the results. Jen, any reactions or comments? So again, it's pretty equal. And shut down, my husband, the statistician, might say there's not a statistical difference here, but shut down is coming in first in this group. Any reactions, Jen?
Yeah, I think this is pretty typical. So I do exercises with groups in organizations and with my students at Columbia. And I ask people to go to, we set up a space in the 4 corners of a room and have people go based on where they come out on this poll. And this looks like the way that it tends to look in the rooms, where people kind of use their feet to do their voting, and they walk to the corners. And yeah, I mean, I think this is pretty typical. The other thing I will say is that sometimes we're good at diagnosing our own habits, and other times, taking that online assessment will help you know for sure if you've got yourself right or not. You can also ask other people, and of course you can ask other people to take that quiz online as well, so that you have a sense of not only what your habit is, but how you've gotten locked in a pattern with them. Something also interesting to think about is if your habit is shut down, what are other people's habits? Are they trying to relentlessly collaborate with you, and then you're kind of hiding and running away from that? Are they blaming you and then you're shutting down? Those are 2 pretty common reasons why, or common kind of patterns that we get stuck in with other people.
Yeah, Wanda, any reactions from you on this poll or people's ways
Yeah,
of diagnosing their habits?
I have one reaction. I think we blame others more than we realize, because
Yeah,
when we say blame others, it sounds like a terrible thing, and I'm not a
yeah,
bad person, and of course I wouldn't do that.
yeah,
But we have very sophisticated ways of making it somebody else's fault.
yeah,
They're just insecure, or they're just not interested in cooperating, or they're just self-centered. Those are
yeah.
all versions of blame yourself. I will say, in my work with women, I think the tendency to shut down is a bit of a survival technique. It's an
Mm,
easier thing to just shut down than it is to try to enter the fray, particularly in a male-dominated world. So it doesn't surprise me that that's slightly higher. But, on any given year, we can all do all four of those.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's important to know. Yeah, I just have to say one other thing that I think is really helpful here. I like the pairwise dynamic of understanding not just what I do,
Mm,
but what the other person might do. And that takes it out of, this is a horrible situation and I can't fix it, to, oh, there might be a way to break the cycle. And that's what's so powerful about this understanding. But it's not just me. I need to understand a bit of where the other person's coming from.
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And so one question, so we're going to turn to some questions online in a minute, but before I take down this poll result, one question that bubbled up and that's relevant to where we stand as the Women's Leadership Initiative is, do you see or do you think, or what's your sense of gender differences in these kinds of habits? Any sense of that?
I'll just say, I don't think there are any. Really, truly. I see plenty of men who are willing to blame others. I see plenty of men who shut down.
Mm,
Across the board, I see all of those behaviors in people.
mm,
I will say, I think sometimes inside a company, the culture gets a dominant pattern. It doesn't mean that there are no longer individual differences, but the culture can become one where we just avoid conflict and nobody puts it on the table.
right.
And that makes it harder to counteract with a different style, because that's just what everybody's come to expect.
Which may be a function of your leader's style, how the leader reinforces a style.
It could be, but it's also as much a history. I mean, when people
Mm,
come to join a company, we tell a bunch of stories to them about what not to do and how not to do it. And, well, somebody got in trouble once when they did it. And you're trying to fit in, so you sort of read, well, nobody ever raises any difficult issues. I'm not going to raise them either.
yeah,
And we just get sucked right into this dominant style.
yeah.
Wendy, I would
Yeah.
add to that, and in the book I write about this, that the ways that we develop our conflict habits are typically based on factors emerging from how we were raised,
Mm,
right? So it could be that we grew up, like I did, in a family of screamers and door slammers, and we learn from a very young age, that that's how you deal with conflict. Or on the opposite side, we grow up in a family, and I've seen many, many, as Wanda has clients and students who grew up in families where conflict was to be avoided at all costs. And so that's still how they deal with conflict today, habitually.
yeah.
Now, that said, the idea that having a competitive nature might lead us to blame others in a habitual way, or when it gets kind of warped into that. I've seen that, like Wanda was talking about, in organizational contexts. And there's a story in the book about one of my clients who was in an HR position, and he was dealing with a sales team, leaders on a sales team, who he felt very attacked by. And when he thought about why that might be the case, he realized that, this is a very competitive team. Their slogan as a team was triple sales or go home.
Wow.
And so once he noticed that this was such a competitive team, okay, he feels attacked. Maybe he's not the only person who's ever felt attacked by these folks. It took away some of the sting for him. It wasn't personal. He saw that this was a cultural vibe on the team, and it kind of made sense. And then when he diagnosed his own habits, he realized that actually he himself was also able to admit that blame others was his habit, and he saw they were stuck in this blame pattern, just firing emails at each other, and he had the opportunity to stop that by doing something different and not just blaming them back the next time. So understanding the culture in which we sit, and also, why did that team have that culture? Well, people are drawn to, people who are competitive are going to naturally be drawn to a competitive environment, et cetera. So.
You know, I had mentioned Warren Bennis before, and as you guys are talking, it strikes me, so I am a big fan of his book, I think from the 80s, On Becoming a Leader. And again, he starts with know yourself, as I was saying, but his next two on becoming a leader is first know yourself, but the second is know your context so that you can engage with it. And the third is be adaptive so that you can dynamically shift. And I think one of the things that we're trying to unpack here is, okay, so if you're going to be adaptive, once you know what your habits are and you know what the culture or what the other person's habits are, what the culture of your organization is, how do you adapt to engage with that? And Wanda, here I'm thinking about some of the insights from your book, You Can't Know It All, where a key piece to you for what you talk about is how one moves up into leadership from very functional or very specific expertise into a broader sense of leadership, and how that role of expertise may hold us back from engaging, from adapting, and from navigating conflict. And I was hoping you can unpack some of that for us.
Yes, it's complicated. So, you know, we come to work and we're valued at work, and we feel like we're contributing at work because of the knowledge I bring to the table and because of my experience and my ability to get stuff done, something I call expertise leadership. It's the reason I have a seat at the table, and particularly for women, that's something we identify with. And it becomes a part of my identity that I know I'm the one who knows this. All right. So, and if you think about how deeply steeped this is in organizational life, we have silos in organizational life, and those are largely driven along expertise lines. If you stop to think about it, we share the same language, the same training, the same approach to problems. And so that expertise creates a cluster, creates my identity, my place at the table, and a cluster. Now, with that, I come to a group where we now need to solve a problem that involves some interaction across very different perspectives and lines of functioning, or silos, if you want to use that word to continue. Yeah. I'm bringing my expertise and my perspective that I believe I know how to solve this problem. But what's going to be required for us to really get to an ultimate solution is my willingness to suspend my expertise. To put it, to kind of say, I got a piece of it, but I don't have 100% of it, and I can't be 100% right. And boy, does that take every ounce of courage we have as human beings. And it's that I often think expertise compounds the conflicts because it makes it harder for us to talk about things that we don't know.
Yeah, I think that's right. We get stuck in the who I am conversation. So can you just say a bit more? Because I think that the idea of our identity standing in the way of conflict can be a little abstract, and yet it's so profound and so important. So say a little bit more about like where it is that our sense of ourselves can stand in the way of our ability to interact with others in a productive way.
All right, so let me give you a recent case I've been dealing with. That'll probably be the best way to illustrate it. Anne, she is in conflict with a peer, just like the survey said at the very beginning. This has been a history. It's gone on for a couple of years. They've gone head to head on some particular problems, and needless to say, it hasn't gone. She's not been satisfied with it. Yeah. At the end of the day, he has one perspective on what's important, like what's the most important thing to do, another perspective on what success looks like, and a third perspective on how urgent this particular problem is to solve. Plus, he comes with a series of expertise that informs how to do that problem. She comes with a completely different set of criteria. Yeah. Success looks different to her. One, she's more of a perfectionist than he is. Yeah. Two, she has a high sense of urgency. Everything is urgent. Pros and cons on that one. And three, she has a different set of analyses and problems that she's going to identify in this particular situation. Those two perspectives are set up to have nothing but tension between them unless each person can begin to say, oh, wait, let me stop and turn to genuinely hear why you think this is not the number one priority to solve, or why you think this is what success looks like, or why you see the problem the way you see it. Yeah. And that's suspending my own thinking. You know, Stephen Covey said, seek first to understand. It's the same principle we've been talking about for ages. But geez, when there's a lot on the line, it's hard to do. It's easy to say it and extraordinarily hard to do.
And it's incredibly emotional.
Yes. I mean, people who say take emotion out of it are kidding themselves.
Yeah.
Emotion is part of it. If I don't care about it, there's no emotion in it. So the ones worth fighting about are the ones where I do care. There is emotion. And we have to learn to work with the emotion, not try to shut down the emotion. Because if I shut down the emotion, I'm into Jen's habit of shutting down. That's what it's about.
Yeah. Yeah. In some ways, Jen, what Wanda's saying sort of reflects your idea of values, both your sort of ideal values and your shadow values.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The ability to, in organizations in particular, but also in families and anywhere, the ability to, like we were saying before, to talk about what's undiscussable is key. And the point that I always like to make about shadow values is that you actually don't need to talk about them. That's not the point. Mm-hmm. So if you yourself can honor inside of your own thoughts, inside of your own self, the idea that you have things going on that you care about inside of yourself that you're not willing to admit to other people, that will shift the dynamic. That will free you from a situation where you have felt stuck. And similarly, closer to what Wanda is talking about, I think, if you can notice that for someone else, they may really care about being recognized, for example. But they can't even admit it to themselves, so there's no way they're going to admit it to you. But you know, because you can observe their behavior, that this is likely something that they really care about, they want to be recognized. What would it look like for you to simply make that acknowledgement in your own, for yourself? You don't need to go and try to have another difficult conversation that's going to lead nowhere or have the risk of exploding. You really don't. Just
someone in the chat said was asking about this question of recognition, saying, it feels like respect. And what do you do when you feel disrespected? Mm-hmm. So I think what you're suggesting is start with yourself, like acknowledge where that comes from yourself before you have to start looking to others to advance that for you.
Yes. Yes. So for example, one of my students, he was really struggling. He came from a family with not a lot of resources, poor family in the middle of New York City. And he had really made it in the world professionally. And he couldn't stand that his mother and his siblings would not recognize his achievements. He felt totally disrespected by his own family. And this had been years and years of struggling with this as an adult. And through literally within the span of a 3-day workshop, he was able to free himself from that conflict. He never picked up the phone and called them, but 3 days later after doing this work, he was able to see they couldn't acknowledge him because it meant something for them that was negative, that they hadn't made it, that they were still stuck where they were. And so it was impossible for them in their world to acknowledge his success. And he became okay with that and found his recognition elsewhere inside of himself, from colleagues of his and friends of his who were with him on the journey he had been on. And so powerful. So that's what I'm talking about the difference between freeing yourself. You don't need anyone else's cooperation to free yourself from conflict. You only need to do the work inside of yourself. And for sure that takes courage, and it's not easy, but guess what? It's a lot harder to try to make other people change than it is to change inside of yourself.
Yeah, I mean, going back to our conversation about spouses, like marital therapy 101 is everybody walks in and says, please change my spouse. Whereas really the value is, what can I do differently? Because that's where the real power comes from. Wanda, you were going to say something else to that comment.
But I'm going to take it off in a slightly different angle. So I'm hesitant because this is a really important point. This thing of respect is a big deal. But when I'm in conflict with somebody, I tend not to like them as a human being. And I turn it into their whole personality characteristics. And one of the tricks that I find works really well is find one thing about that person and stay not on the characteristics, but on their behaviors, on something they do that you can see adds value. Whether you're going to do it or not, but just one thing. And it's amazing how much that little tiny bit of acknowledgement will go towards making it easier to work with that individual.
You know, it resonates with an idea in psychology called the fundamental attribution error. And the idea of the fundamental attribution error is essentially that when we look at ourselves, we see such a variety of different ways that we behave in the world that if something goes off or wrong, we acknowledge that it's situational or the context. But when we look at other people and something goes off or wrong, we see a pattern in their behavior. We attribute it to their whole personality. And so your point is, well, let's take that down and, you know, maybe do unto others as we do to ourselves. Look at others as really multi-dimensional people and see that there's situational parts and there's good and there's bad, and we can sort of look at these various parts and give them some credit for the good as well.
Wendy, one other thing we can do to raise our empathy for other people is one of the practices that I talk about is conflict mapping. And that just simply means putting down on a piece of paper who else is involved in the situation beyond just the most obvious people. Like, it's not just about me and you, but it's actually wider than that. And by doing that practice, we get to understand the pressures that are the influences that are things that are influencing other people that we, outside of doing a practice like that, we are just not aware of. But when we make ourselves aware of it, we can have empathy for them, right? Like in the situation of me and my mom, when I realized that she was missing my grandmother and her sister-in-law, who she used to talk on the phone with every day, it didn't take away the pain that I had been experiencing of her blaming me for something that I felt I hadn't done wrong, but it did at least help me understand why she was asking to talk.
Yeah, there are a whole lot of questions popping up in the chat, and I want to get to more of those. By the way, one of the things popping up in the chat is questions about accessing both of your books and your resources, and I know people are putting that into the chat. Our team will certainly send those out after this session to make sure people have access to them. One question is about moving this to the team level. So both of you have worked not just with individuals, but also with teams. And so we could start with ourselves, but then the question is, how do we then spread this, navigate conflicts that then turn up on teams and manage this at the team level?
I'm going to start with opinion, then I'll let Jen mop up with sort of the final decision on this one. One of the issues around teams, the starting point, I believe, is that we have to decide that we're going to do more than information share.
Yeah.
If we're just there to trade information, keep each other informed, we will never do the work it takes as a team to be able to work through a conflict or a disagreement and get to a good place. But if as a team you feel like you own collectively an ultimate outcome, and I mean that, own it collectively, not individual doing parts, but own it collectively, then the only way you're ever going to get there is to actually work your way through the tensions and disagreements and debates and et cetera to get that kind of genuine, honest commitment to action. And you have no choice. Yeah. And then when you're starting to do that, we're now then into the kind of stuff that Jen has been talking about, and it has to do with how we have these conversations, how we understand what each other are bringing to the table, how we understand the conflict mapping that's affecting everybody. And at that, I'll let Jen jump in and give her own view on this one.
Yeah.
Yes. So the conflict habits and patterns that we were talking about before are totally applicable, not only at the individual level, but also at the team level. So you can diagnose what are the habits, like we started touching on this before, what habit does our team typically use? Are people on the team typically blaming each other? Are people on the team typically avoiding others? Are they typically relentlessly collaborating? And just knowing that can be helpful. You can also think about it not only internal to one team, how do people on the team typically treat each other, but also how does our team interact with another team inside of our organization? How does our team interact with clients, customers, vendors, anyone else outside the organization? Again, this can be incredibly eye-opening. There's something else I wanted to say. Did you want to?
While you're thinking, I'll throw in a different comment, but come back to this one. As you're looking at those conflict habits, also look at the depth of relationships that exist around that table, because you'll have some people who are going to be very close together and who are going to have a lot of conversation and share a lot in common and are going to back each other up because they are close.
Yes.
So there will be loyalty. And you'll have others who are not so close and have had tensions before, and that tension is going to show up again. So some of the politics that we often dislike in organizations really comes down to personal history and personal depth of relationship, how much I trust that individual.
Yeah.
I remembered also, thank you, Wanda, and the thing that I had wanted to say was when you do the conflict mapping for a team. So I just did this with a client of mine who is himself a consultant to teams. And he had been so focused on one interaction on the team that he was trying to help, which was there was a board of directors and he saw them as in conflict with the CEO of the organization. And that the board of directors is trying to get the CEO to step down and allow for someone to succeed him, and they couldn't figure out how to do it, and the CEO is not doing what they want. And by mapping it out, what my client realized was that he was focused on only one relationship that was at a loggerheads or stuck on this conflict loop, but he hadn't looked at the board of directors themselves and what was going on there. And it turned out, of course, that one of the main reasons I think why that board of directors was not making any headway with that CEO is because there was conflict amongst the board of directors. And to Wanda's point, there were people who had more power and status in that board of directors and people who had less. And people kind of jockeying for their point of view being the right one. Some people thinking the CEO should step down. Some people thinking he shouldn't. And people having conversations at the level of yes, no, and not why do you think that? What are you concerned about? If you would step down, what might happen? So shifting, the mapping can really shift our focus from what we think is happening and there's a problem we can't get through to, hey, there's some leverage. And again, that's that sense of freedom of, oh my gosh, we've just been focused in the wrong place.
You know, it reminds me, Jen, you and I had a conversation with a mutual friend of ours where the idea is, the presenting issue is rarely the real issue. And that's true with our kids and that's true with our partners, but that's certainly true with the team too. Wanda, it goes back to your point about an understanding or a learning conversation, starting with sort of a deeper analysis rather than an assumption or a decision conversation, that we have to start with sort of understanding that deeper analysis.
It's true. I believe at the end of the day, it's all down to our ability to have better conversations in the organization. I have to give you a quote, though, I heard yesterday that is just kind of like, sitting with me here in this conversation. It's from Scott Miller. He's at Franklin Covey. Yeah. And he says, everybody says people are our greatest asset. And he said, no. The relationships between people are the killer app.
And this goes back to, I mean, many people on the line are leaders and have teams, and they can direct those teams. They can choose to do some conflict mapping on those teams. And a lot of people on the line are parts of teams or don't have quite that leadership responsibility. And this goes back to where we started, which is what can we do as individuals as we enter into those conversations, so we can really think through our relationships. Or if somebody asked, it's one thing to map the team, but what do I do as an individual entering into the team? And I think I'm hearing you both talk about some practices, both that leaders can do, but also that individuals can do.
I think first off, I always say never go it alone. Like find somebody who's got a similar perspective. So, because one person we can silence in an organization. So assuming there's somebody who's closer to you, 2 people can change the dynamics in a 10-person group. You don't have to be the leader, but that's my take. I'll let Jen respond to that one as well.
Yeah. One of the other practices in the optimal outcomes method that we didn't talk about yet is this idea of imagining what your ideal future looks like. So often when we're stuck in conflict, we are focusing backwards on who's to blame and what went wrong, and that can be very seductive. And so I encourage us to think ahead, but not only use our rational thinking brain to look ahead at the future of what we do want, because if the rational thinking brain could have solved the problem, it probably would have done so a long time ago, right? So. Yeah. Instead, we want to put down the rational thinking brain and engage our imagination. And one of the best ways I know how to do that is to make use of all 5 of our senses. So what will it look like then? What will it sound like then? But also, what would it taste or even smell like? What will it feel like emotionally or tactilely in that future state? So if you are in a team where you feel stuck on a conflict loop, I think it is still worth, absolutely, it's worth mapping out that situation and noticing, where are you on that map? And what leverage and power do you have? Sometimes it can be, again, very seductive to think that only the leader or the person with formal authority has the capacity to make a change, when actually we might have more informal power than we think we do.
Yeah.
So that's number 1. And then number 2 is ask yourself, what would an ideal future here even look like? And what power do I have to make maybe tiny shifts?
Yeah.
Tiny shifts to help bring that future into reality.
Yeah, we only have a few minutes left, and there's so many great questions online, so hopefully people can continue these conversations. I wanted to, and by the way, both of you, there's been a lot of like high fives or virtual chat type high fives saying, yes, like these ideas resonate. I want to just end with maybe some very brief comments on one last question. Early on, somebody asked about the question of internal conflict. And I feel like as we're all in isolation, we're more aware of that internal conflict, and it could really impact how we then navigate these relationships more broadly. So any thoughts on how we then navigate that challenge?
Yeah. Yes. Oh, it's such a great thing to be aware of. And one of the things that I've had students of mine do is to notice the internal dialogue, and you can even personify it. So if you notice that, part of me wants to say this, but the other part of me wants to say that, or part of me wants to make a decision going this way, and the other part wants to do something the other way, personify those. So I've seen people say, this is Miss has to be right, and this is Ms., just wants to be comfortable, or whatever it is.
Right.
And then you could even write out dialogue between the two of them, have them be in conversation with each other and see what they say to each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I add one to this one, which is, so especially to an audience of women, but it is equally applicable to men. All of us, when we're trying to do something that's new, have a sense of imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
It's just there. And a lot of that internal turmoil comes from that sense of being an imposter. It's not the only thing, but there's a lot of it. So could you give yourself permission? It's okay. You don't know how to do it. That's perfectly normal.
And then that gives you permission to learn how to do it and grow into it, which goes back to this notion of be adaptive.
Or to ask people, or to get another perspective, or to change a habit, or to try to do something different. Or there's a lot that comes out of stopping being in this, I can't be this way.
Well, I love that as a punctuating point, particularly because there's so much that's coming at us at this moment where we're all dealing with what the reality of the world looks like, a new normal, and all of us are being asked to pivot and change, which is going to raise that internal conflict, which is going to raise that relational conflict, which is going to raise that team conflict. So if all those people commenting on the chat that you're experiencing conflict, I think the first insight is you're in good company. And the second is that there's some real wisdom from both of you of how to then pause, reflect, self-reflect, and then engage, reflect on the other to really be able to navigate that. So thank you both. It really, what a pleasure to have you both and to learn from both of you. So thank you both for joining us. I will just end for everybody online to say thank you all online. It's really been a pleasure to do these webinars. We hope that you join us for the next 3. Please do feel free to join us, follow us, and engage with us and be in conversation with us on social media. And I will end there. I'm going to go back and turn back on our Spotify music if you want to join on that as well. And we hope that we will see you again in a couple of weeks. So Jen and Wanda, thank you both, and thank you everybody for joining us.